guys know, we've had some problems with the software and with the visuals on this show over the last few months. But Dia has been working away in the background, doing incredibly well, and we found some new software that we hope will really take us forward. It could be in the future, we could be going out live again, we could be involving people in the talks and everything, and the interviews as well. I'm also delighted to announce that as of literally around about 25 minutes ago, I got an email from Professor Erlander Haraldsson in Iceland, who is the final person for a full booking of guests for this year, which is absolutely incredible. It's the first time we've had a whole series of guests booked this advanced in the year. Now, on top of that, we've also got at least 2 or 3 other writers who will be moving and be joining us in early 2019. So this is quite incredible. And we're going to be going into some very, very interesting areas. We've got neurologists, we've got quantum physicists, we've got authors who are pushing the envelope in so many different areas. But today I'm delighted to introduce an interview, a two-way interview really, with somebody that I met around about 3 years ago. And we've become really good friends. We both did an event called Breaking Convention, which takes place every 2 years at the University of Greenwich. And at that time, we didn't know of each other's existence, but we both went to each other's talks at this particular event. It was only about a year, 18 months later, when I was asked to speak at the JB Priestley Society annual event at Queen Mary University in East London. And just before I was starting my talk, I recognised one of the members of the audience, because I'd gone to his talk the previous year. And funnily enough, he said that he had actually been to my talk. Now, on top of that, I then discovered not only that, but he's actually JB Priestley's great-grandson, a gentleman called Luke Dodson. And we just hit it off, the way you do, you meet people, and you've got so many areas of interest and everything else. So now we meet quite regularly, we have coffee. As probably many of you will know, I'm working at the National Gallery at the moment. And it's been very, very convenient because myself and Luke and 3 or 4 other people regularly meet at the espresso bar there, and talk for hours and hours about various topics and everything else. And in many ways, it reminds me of the Walker group that I used to run in Liverpool. So we're building up slowly a group of people down in London. And again, if anybody's interested in joining us, please do. Now, also on that, I had a meeting on Wednesday night with 2 people from the Scientific and Medical Network who were very, very keen to try and get a new Scientific and Medical Network group started up in the southeast, probably in Sussex or Surrey. I will let everybody know on Facebook and my various other sources how this will develop. But what we're planning to do is to have regular monthly meetings again, where we'll have formal speakers and everything else as well. So it's building up quite nicely at the moment. As well, in terms of, by the time this is broadcast, I'll have also done an event which I'll be doing tomorrow at Alternatives in Piccadilly, which looks like it's going to be a sellout. I mean, there's well over 100 tickets already being sold for this, which is really good. But the big issue and the big event will be on the 12th of February at an event in a meeting place in East London in Shoreditch, where I'll be speaking about the out-of-body experience. But breaking news, I will have with me a lucid light device, a Lucia device as well. Again, if you want further details on this, just check on my website or on my Facebook page to give you further details. Okay, without further ado, Luke, really great again to see you.
Thanks. Nice to see you too. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Absolutely. Right, okay. Now, so you can give people a little bit about a background as to who Luke Goldman Dodgson is, what you've been up to now, and everything else, and indeed what actually stimulated you getting involved in Breaking Convention, for instance. So give us a little bit of background as to who you are.
I come from a sort of very humanities-based family and background, really. So I studied literature. I studied comparative literature at the University of Kent from around 2008. It was during this period of time that at the university, I think it was the first formal psychedelic society, student society, was set up by my friends Dave King, Ollie Genbash and Jacob Brandt, who I'd met these guys sort of independently through sort of various, shared interests in music and stuff like that. And they started to organise these lectures and things, which eventually Breaking Convention came out of that. But all the while I was this sort of extracurricular interest in psychedelics, and I was exploring that sort of field through both the literary side and the experiential side as well. And in my academic studies, I was, through the avenue of literature, getting interested in mysticism, and particularly writers like Borges. When I studied my MA and my Masters, I did Burroughs and Borges with reference to the Kabbalah. I was studying with another good friend of mine, Will Rowlandson, who's an expert on Borges and mysticism. From that, what kind of interested me when I was doing my BA and MA, I was sort of thinking, well, why do people read literature, and why do people like it, and what's the point of studying it? Probably a lot of people who study English have this kind of thought, and for me there was something experiential and transformative about the process of reading certain texts. And in the background, there was always I knew about Priestley, I knew about his interests in JW Dunn and stuff like that. And in sort of like, maybe I should look into that at some point. There seems to be some overlap, but it was very much sort of like, I was getting on with my own thing, not really looking into that side of my own family history. And then that actually changed because I had seen your talk at the National Theatre back in 2009, during the run of Time and the Conways. Apparently I did see the production of Time and the Conways there, but as it was during my university days, the memory seems to have been deleted and lost in some sort of horrendous undergraduate haze. But I do remember your talk very well, and I remember being very impressed with it, and it came at a nice time, because actually my grandfather, who was the husband of JB's daughter Sylvia, who's Michael Goman, he was in hospital at that time, or maybe he had recently, I can't remember the chronology, but he passed away that summer. So I was thinking a lot about issues of death and consciousness, and whether consciousness is really located only in the body. And I remember having a sort of conversation with my mum in the kitchen of the house, the sort of what was then the family house, about sort of, is there some sort of survival of bodily death? And I remember finding your talk on that very interesting, very sort of very comforting as well, because you brought in all of this in-depth data from the field of, say, quantum physics and stuff like that, and also very lucid explanation of the theories of people like J.W. Dunn and Peter Ouspensky. And then I came to your talk in 2015 at Queen Mary, where I also met Kit Price as well. And from there, that really sparked off. I suddenly realised, because as I realised, you were also at Breaking Convention. A whole bunch of other people who come to the talk were also at Breaking Convention. It was this really interesting meeting of sort of, sort of a family, like my family history, and then my sort of slightly wacky sort of social scene that I move in. sort of seemed to come together in quite a nice way. So from there, I'd been had already unsuccessfully applied for a funded doctoral program on Borges, and only having very rudimentary Spanish, it was not really, wasn't really that enticing to the funding panel to have me doing that. I got a place and everything. But then I suddenly realized, well, what am I doing? What am I doing? Putting so much pressure on myself to get up my language skills, although I have been sort of improving Spanish very slowly since then. When I actually could be looking into my own family history and also bringing in these sort of interests of people like Borges as well. And so I've been drafting research proposals for a couple of different universities on Priestley and his interest in, particularly his relationship with Carl Jung, and branching out from that, there's other contemporaries like Dunn Ouspensky, Gerald Hurd, Aldous Huxley, people like that, and finding it's a really fascinating period of time. The thinkers of that time, particularly people like Priestley, Huxley, Jung, are not really that well recognised in academia. People like in the field of English, someone like George Orwell is incredibly prominent, and he's really sort of considered this, sort of just titan. I think he's a great writer and everything, but I think Priestley and Huxley, people like that, maybe had some things to say that maybe went a bit further than where Orwell went. So that's roughly where I am now, and sort of that sort of intersection between the cultural and artistic side of things and how it relates to psychology and philosophy and spirituality and religion and related things.
It does rather fascinate me that there were you, obviously being aware of your heritage, obviously being aware of your great-grandfather and what he had achieved, and then doing a degree in English, but presumably never really linking, as even my generation, Priestley was considered to be slightly old-fashioned. He wrote these kind of slightly arch plays of very, very sort of upper-middle-class individuals in the 1930s, discussing the things of the day. And I'd never actually realised his power myself. But it is intriguing that somebody like yourself, who had a direct link, you're his blood, you're his family, did you ever consider, when you were at university, was it ever an issue to you, or of any area of interest to you, of what Priestley was trying to do at that time? And if there wasn't the case, what was the reason for that?
Well, it was certainly something that I now and then managed to name drop in a slightly undignified fashion, because we got very good at that during my early adult life. Hopefully, I'm a little bit more circumspect now, but it wasn't actually, and that I think it's because it was part of my family history, and you just sort of, I remember being taken along to all these events and things, and plaque unveilings and the statue unveiling in Bradford and things like this, and then but I still, it wasn't like it was like, I didn't feel negative towards it at all. It was, I always quite enjoyed seeing his plays. So it wasn't that I was sort of down on Priestley or dismissive of his stuff at all. I liked it, I enjoyed it, I liked the whole, I really liked his time plays. I found it very interesting. But I think it was because it was like, you don't, it's just stuff that's in your house, your family household, and you want to go out and sort of break out new territory and stuff like that. And then it was really sort of the obviousness of actually applying my university training to my own sort of family history in that way only came up about 3 years ago, after that lecture, and then subsequently after that, a very interesting talk by Will Self up at the University of Huddersfield, which was part of their JB Priestley annual JB Priestley lecture series. So I'm not sure who they got this year. I'm not sure if they haven't heard about running for a little while, but I know that they've had, and there's a very interesting talk by myself up there. So that all of that sparked off my my interest in all of these things, and then going back to these plays and suddenly finding out about something like Johnson over Jordan, which is a really mind-bending piece of work. Finding out that he'd written a play based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or also particularly based on the Jung's psychological commentary on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and this is not really known about. I mean, everybody sort of knows about an Inspector Calls, and few people know about Time the Conways, or they know about Edith's Journey or Angel Payton or something. I mean, Johnson over Jordan is a very strange play and a very difficult one to produce, and I think also one that doesn't carry across particularly well on paper, which is why you get these terrible critical misreadings of it. There's some very awful stuff that's been written about it. Awful in the sense of awfully underestimating, I think, the power of the play just through only absorbing the text. And then, the fact that one needs to see the productions of these plays to actually take them in properly, I think is underappreciated. Recently watched the 1985 BBC adaptation of Time the Conways, and only really realised then what an incredibly stark and brutal play it actually is on the surface. It really does. It doesn't pull a lot of punches, and this whole image of Priestley as being this kind of, writing these genial, kind of slightly silly, slightly dated, sort of living room comedies, which he did write a few of as well, because he needed to make a living, and that's what people liked. And, he also, I think he enjoyed writing, and they weren't necessarily they weren't what he was interested in. Whereas a writer with private income, a writer from a wealthy background, would have been able to write only the things that they're interested in, subsequently therefore would have had a much more, probably a much stronger reputation amongst those who, like to consider themselves part of the cultural elite, or whatever it is.
Yeah, I'm reminded actually, Luke, of you know, how Virginia Woolf used to dismiss him, and the Bloomsbury Group and everybody else. And of course, you know, he wrote plays like When We Are Married and everything else, which were kind of like a farce and everything else. But I think you've hit the nail on the head here, that in that generation, you know, Jack was in the position that he was from a lower middle class background. He didn't have independent wealth. He had to work for himself. He fought in the First World War. He then got a scholarship, and then actually became a clerk in a place in Bradford. And he started to write then for a market, and he had to write for his market, and people expected it. But I always get the feeling, you know, from having, you know, sort of almost lived his life for him when I was writing the new book, I felt that you can feel the frustrations, you know, effective when The Dragon's Mouth, which was one of his plays he wrote with Giacomo Hawks. You know, as you were saying about the Jungian analysis, there he is, he's writing a play using the Jungian archetypes. And a wonderful idea, the idea that a group of people, there's been an epidemic on a cruise liner, and 4 people have been isolated, and they're in this sea cave called the Dragon's Mouth. And the 4 characters are the 4 standard Jungian archetypes. So they follow certain routes and everything else. And there he's writing this incredibly esoteric stuff. And only I'd recently made the links here that you're probably not aware of this, and probably a lot of people aren't, but I'm a qualified psychometrician, and one of the things I do is I work in companies, I go to companies, and I apply psychometric testing. Now, one of the major psychometric testing tools is something called the 16PF. And only I hadn't realized until reading your great-grandfather's work that the 16PF and the guy who invented the 16PF, Raymond Cattell, had actually used Jungian archetypes for this. And this is used in business all the time. And there, you know, Priestley in the late 1930s, or later with The Dragon's Mouth, but effectively was bringing these ideas forward. I've used the phrase before, I think he was so far ahead of the curve that people can't see him anymore. You know, we're still catching up with him.
Yeah.
And, you know, we have a mutual love of Borges. You know, and when I was reading, particularly The Other Place, in the mid-1950s, Priestley brought out a series of short stories, science fiction short stories. And I'll guarantee, if you actually told somebody that Borges had written them, they'd go, it's wonderful, it's magical realism, it's exactly what we expect from blind intellectuals in Argentina.
Yeah.
But of course, because it was written by a guy from Bradford, they didn't get it, did they?
Yeah, no. This is true, I think. Yeah, it's an interesting parallel with Jung as well, because Jung was incredibly far ahead of his time, and yet Jung is more popular than he is respected in the academic field, even in the humanities, where the kind of in psychology, obviously the behaviourists have sort of mostly taken hold. Maybe signs that they're shifting now, but as far as I'm aware, from an outside perspective, it seems like the behaviourists and sort of that lot, the people who like to the rats, clearly taken over, and Jung is sort of beyond the pale. Freud is mostly beyond the pale, but just about okay. Yeah, but Jung is out there, and then even in the humanities, you can talk about Freud. He's not that popular now. He's not that cool, but it's okay, psychoanalysis, and then you've got Lacan and that sort of stuff, and that's all right amongst the people who are into that. But Jung is really not considered particularly, he's the mystic. There's people who study literature, they make their living reading stories, and they can't yeah, so you've got Priestley as well, who's popular, and but then, not necessarily hugely respected. So he's on the GCSE syllabus, but he doesn't really turn up on many undergraduate syllabi.
Well, hopefully that will change in the future, and hopefully with my new book, Time in the Rose Garden, which is due out in 10 days' time, I'm hoping that this will change this attitude. Now, I'm not considered to be an academic in any shape or form, but I feel that what I'm trying to do with this book is introduce a new audience to say, look deeper than what this guy is saying. I've been interested in mysticism and the occult and everything since I was 10 or 11 years of age. And when I started reading in greater depth Priestley's material, I started to see all kinds of parallels. I mean, he was reading Advaita and Vedanta way back in the 1920s. He was very, very, very advanced in his ideas. But I think his challenge is, because his writing style is of its time, the problem is that people don't necessarily get it. I mean, we both know the work that Graham Murray is now doing with Time Was, Time Is, this undiscovered play. And everybody, in case you're interested in this, myself and Luke and Graham Murray, I think, are the only 3 people in the world who have read this play. And it is a brand new JB Priestley play, and it is absolutely wonderful. And what is fascinating about this, when I first met Graham Murray, we interviewed Graham on this program 2 months ago. And when Graham first discovered or was told about the play by Tom Priestley, he read it way back in, the mid-70s, something like that, when he first came across it. And he felt that the play simply didn't work because Priestley had not got the language of somebody in the mid-1970s. Whereas he's now revisiting the play, because the argument is now 1975, whatever, is now as much a period piece to us now as 1914 was, where a lot of the action takes place, because it's a time slip thing. And this play is simply wonderful, and you have to go and dig deeper to find these nuggets and wonderful ideas that he puts forward. And you and I have discussed just how wonderful Time and the Conways is, how it embroiders and brings in J.W. Dunn in the cleverest of ways. And they have wonderful twists, as this new play does. But effectively going back, say, to the other place, I know you and I have discussed in the past the stories there, but can you describe what your favourite is from that lot? Which was the one that really struck you and you thought, this is an amazing story?
Oh, that's a difficult question. There's too many of them in that one. The other places, it's a fantastic little collection. Though I did not know that it existed until one day I was in Brighton for some reason. I was visiting some friends down there, and I had a couple of hours to spare, so I went down to the Jubilee Library, and I wonder what they've got by old JB. So I looked at them and saw a couple of things, and there was the other play, and I'd never heard of it, so I picked it out, and it's about 45 minutes in the lounge of the library, on one of the couches, sort of reading this thing before I had to catch my train or something. And I'd never heard of it before, and it was fantastic. The ones that stand out include, the title story, The Other Place, is in fact, they're all very much like something from the Twilight Zone, or something like the sort of anthologies with very, very nicely composed stories where there's a fantastic sort of little twist at the end, or a conclusion that kind of seals the whole thing. The Other Place is about a guy who's been to this sort of wonderful paradise that was introduced to him by a kind of strange magician that shows him this portal, and he goes through to this golden land, and he falls in love with a girl who sort of works in this local pub in this golden place. And then it's a classic sort of mythical idea that he's given one challenge. Now, don't, you're meeting this girl, but don't don't get excited. You have to wait until a certain hour. But he gets excited and he opens this door, goes through the door, which I think is her room or something like that. And he ends up back in the real world, and then sort of trying to get back to this mythical place. There's another one, which is called the Grey Ones, and there was a weird little coincidence because you wrote a story called The Grey Eye, which is Greek for the Grey Ones. So that was a nice little connection there as well. The Grey Ones is basically a sort of kind of presaging the ideas of David Icke and people like that. There's a guy who he sees a psychiatrist because he thinks that the world is being taken over by shape-shifting toads from another dimension. And he just I think probably the weirdest scene that Priestley ever wrote was this guy describing seeing a toad ceremony conducted by these toads, and they all reveal their true form. They conduct a ritual in some hall, and it's a very, very odd. Priestley didn't tread very far into the really far out, the fantastical events in his. His aesthetic was, he described it as being like the painter Bruegel, I think, the Dutch painter, who would have a sort of everyday sort of peasant scene, and then in the background some sort of fantastic looking castle, sort of fairy tale, impossible castle in the background that was a sort of this hint of this other world that was kind of poking through into our one. He said in possibly Midnight in the Desert or Rain Upon God's Hill that he was aiming for that aesthetic, the ordinary everyday life with this little hint of something else from another world coming through. And the other places are a great showcase for that as well. There's also, of course, his forays into science fiction, like The Magicians. And this is a kind of like, it could be read as a prelude to Brave New World, because it's about a cabal of powerful people trying to market a particular kind of sedative drug in order to control the population. And this, what I describe as a trio of occults fulfill their plans. One of them is based on Gary Nachman, our mutual friend, brought to my attention. One of them is based on Gurdjieff, probably, or a mixture of Gurdjieff and Uspensky. Is a Bulgarian character whose name escapes me, but it is very Gurdjieffian the way he speaks. And then, there's also Saturn Over the Water, which is a sort of quite fun, quite silly, but very interesting adventure story. And I think that there's a character in that that's based on the Italian fascist occult philosopher Julius Evola, because there's a character in that called Arnaldos, who espouses this kind of sort of quasi-fascist, sort of neo-Nietzschean aristocratic occult philosophy, and he talked about it trying to start a nuclear war to erase civilization and start up from scratch with this sort of very, very intensely hierarchical society, which is basically what Evola, his writings are all about. This absolutely insane sort of fascistic, weird, Aryan sort of Atlantis-based cosmology about, a kind of occult warrior king elite dominating society because that's the divine order. And very weird. I don't know if he read. I don't know if he was aware. I don't know if Priestley was aware of Evola, but his reading of its character is so similar to Evola's philosophy makes me think that perhaps there's something influence there.
There was a lot of when I was reading Priestley last summer, or some of his more obscure stuff, I kept being reminded for no apparent reason. Have you read any Olaf Stapleton?
Yes, I'm working through Star Maker now.
Oh, right.
Given to me for my birthday. So I've been working through that. Yeah.
What a coincidence! That is really interesting because Stapleton was from the Wirral, and a lot of the scenes, because that's originally where I'm from, and a lot of the scenes in a lot of his writings are actually based on the Wirral. So any time that you want to, I know you had your plan to follow the footsteps of English Journey. If you do ever do that, you can probably resonate with Olaf Stapleton as well, because his work is fascinating. But for me, the other place and various other pieces of short story writing, and indeed novels he wrote, I think of the short story The Statues. And again, if I'd read that in Ficciones or any of the works of Borges, I wouldn't even notice that it wasn't Borges. Because in The Statues, he has this kind of ability that I think there are very few writers do in the science fiction field, of giving a feeling of otherworldliness. The only other writer I know that does this is probably Ray Bradbury. That, there's this kind of, as you say, it's like a Bruegel painting, and there's this kind of other world breaking through. Now, to me, I'm pretty sure that Jack would never have been aware of some of the further reaches of quantum physics. He touches upon some of it in Man and Time, his 1964 book, but really, for instance, he misses out, for instance, on Hugh Everett III's Many Worlds interpretation and other areas as well. But he's very much talking about this, about time being different. I'm reminded, for instance, of his little-known war play called Desert Highway. And in Desert Highway, we have the most amazing time slip where a group of British soldiers in the Second World War in the Syrian desert or the Iraqi desert suddenly find themselves back in ancient Mesopotamia, and during various invasions that were taking place at that time. And again, it's this kind of idea of this mirror place. And he writes this time and time again in many of his little-known novels. He has this idea of time slips and people going back, bringing that information forward, which of course is the central theme in many ways of Time and the Conways, where Kay Conway in the first scene is in 1919, then she goes into some kind of reverie state, temporal lobe seizure, whatever we want to call it, and she finds herself in 1937, 1938. Only then in the third scene to then go back and realise she's back in 1919 again, which sounds very arch and very predictable, but in Priestley's hands, it's made into something and a commentary on society and how society has changed over that time. Because people forget that, he was heavily involved in politics. He was a lifelong socialist. He stood as an MP, didn't he, I think, in the first general election after the Second World War. He did lots of things. And he was an interesting man in so many ways in terms of that. And that's what I'm trying to bring out in the new book. So moving on in terms of things that we need to talk about, I'd like to now take the opportunity to switch round so you can ask me a little bit about the new book and what I think about it and what your thoughts are as well. Because Luke wrote an excellent, I had 3 people write the introductions to the book, There was Dr. Kit Price, who's an academic from Queen Mary University. Graham Murray wrote it, and so did Luke. So I'd like to thank Luke formally for his involvement at this stage, because his introduction is worth the price of the book. Believe me, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. Very, very good. So fire away if you've got any questions of me in terms of the book. We've got around about 15 minutes left. So if you want to fire away, or any thoughts or even observations you'd like to make in terms of discussion points.
Well, I had the privilege of looking at an earlier draft of the book, which you sent me before, and I was really pleased and impressed with it. And there's a whole load of material there that I hadn't been aware of. It's one of the things I think is really, I think you've got a real knack for the literary biography, because your book on Philip K. Dick is also it's great. It's a great read, and anybody listening who's not read it and is interested in Philip K. Dick, I'd recommend it. So it's great to have seen that thoroughness applied to JB's work. And there's a real audience for his stuff, of people who are interested in these fields and aren't necessarily aware that he was quite so involved with them. For example, after that panel that we did up in Bradford, I was talking to a chap from the Uspensky Society in Leeds. And he came up to me and said, I had no idea that Priestley was into Uspensky at all. I came along because I like Priestley, but I had no idea that he was directly influenced by Uspensky. Yeah, you know, it's incredible that the connections have not been drawn out there. So that's something that I look forward to seeing with your book, and a lot of new people coming to Priestley's writing, and really finding a lot that they can resonate with. The other thing is that I think you're the perfect man to write this biography now, because you've done so much work on updating and bringing forward and bringing your own interpretation of, you know, the quantum physics aspect, the neuroscience of the whole thing, you know, the ideas of Dunn, the ideas of Uspensky, ideas of the sort of expressions of the mystics through the ages. So that's a really nice connection to have there, because you've got such a polymath approach, which there isn't enough of these days. There aren't enough polymaths. There need to be more polymaths and more autodidacts and more people bringing things, because, you know, people in university departments, they get too specialised, and they get within their own narrow little box, and then they're well, no, I can't really go outside of that. It's changing a little bit now to some extent, but it's also, you know, it's slow. So yeah, I'm very much looking forward to the release of the book and to getting my own copy, and to seeing where it comes from there.
Right, thank you. Because one of the things that you were saying before that quite amused me was about the toads in not the other place, in the other place, but one of the stories in the other place. Because of course both you and I are interested in dimethyltryptamine and entheogens and everything else. And when you were describing that, I was kind of grinning to myself and thinking, good Lord, if Jack had known about 5-MeO-DMT, particularly because he'd actually spent time in Nevada, and he'd spent time in California, and he'd spent time at the ranch in Arizona. So who knows, he might have come across the Sonoran Desert Toad at some stage, in which case he could have actually tried 5-MeO-DMT. I mean, one of the funny stories that I came across in my research, which I told to Tom Priestley, which is not in the book, because the book is about Priestley, the writer, and there's no real sort of personal anecdotes. But one of the things I came across was this wonderful story now how did it go? They were staying at the ranch in Arizona, and Jack and his two daughters and Tom had gone up to the Grand Canyon, and they were going down the Grand Canyon on donkeys, as people do, and they met somebody coming on the other way up, an elderly man with his wife. And I said to Tom, did he remember that? And I can't remember whether Tom did remember it or not when I met him. But I'd actually discovered that elderly man was in fact George Bernard Shaw. So there was this wonderful meeting, and I know that it was always the case that Priestley was always compared to George Bernard Shaw in a very, very negative way. Mm-hmm. And yet, I've studied, and I was doing A-level English literature, and I've studied a lot of George Bernard Shaw's plays, and I find them similarly arch in many, many ways. And yet, nobody ever thinks that about George Bernard Shaw because he's an icon. Whereas Jack isn't. And I mean, I'm sure even if Jack had actually tried, and he did try quite a few experimental plays, as we've discussed earlier, sort of Johnson over Jordan was incredibly experimental. He had avant-garde music, he had dance, he had the most amazing concept of a near-death experience, as you say, the Bardo state. But because it was so expensive, it only ran for a few weeks, and he had to bail it out with money and everything else. Now, you and I have discussed, and I know your father Mo as well, we've discussed the idea of probably trying to get on a kind of watered-down version of this play, particularly if we can actually frame it under the present-day understanding and knowledge of the near-death experience.
Yeah.
Because here we have a classic near-death experience scenario. We have even what's called the panoramic life review taking place, where Johnson sees images from his own past, and he sees them from different viewpoints. Because, of course, one of the other things that Jack was fascinated by from his studies of Vedanta was the idea of an over-consciousness, that there is a greater consciousness that we all attune into during creative periods. This, again, is something that's central to his writing. From a much younger person's point of view, in terms of how you see Priestley, how do you see him? Not as a member of the family, but as a writer generally. Do you feel that we will be able to ever recover and make him more approachable and more resonant with younger academics like yourself, or do you think we've already missed the bus on this?
Oh, I think it's pretty feasible and pretty likely that it's going to happen. I think it's sort of happening already. People are coming back to Priestley and reappraising him. As lots of plays and things getting revived, and there's a very expensive bit of rent to get Time Was Time Is off the ground. And I think as more people look into his writing, they'll find that there's a lot there that a lot of contemporary people will relate to, in all kinds of ways. I mean, it's interesting because, looking at writers that were, or thinkers that were really taken up by the hippie generation, say like Borges or Tolkien, they themselves were not very pro-hippie. Borges sympathised with the anti-war aspect to an extent, I think, but they were both sort of weren't really keen on that whole thing. Whereas JB was actually quite sympathetic to the hippie movement, with reservations. He talks about it in Over the Long High Wall, and he says some very interesting things about the whole hippie movement, speaking as a man then in his 60s, I think, 60s or maybe 70s. And he was he got it. You know, I think he basically he understood what they were trying to do, and he sympathised with that. And there's all kinds of things. There's all kinds of ways in which I think the reason people will come back to it and realise that there's a lot more going on than maybe they realised before is because so much of his writing was about not tapping into necessarily the transient moment in which the thing was written, but something deeper than that, something deeper than time. So people could come and go, and people like, John Osborne or whatever, maybe were writing in the 1950s, were writing stuff that was really, really appropriate for the 1950s. But then, I don't know, are people going to look at this stuff and go, this is of timeless quality? Maybe. I don't know. But I don't feel likely to look at Priestley writing and say, well, there's something... At his best, he really was connecting with something that isn't bound to a transient sort of cultural moment, really.
Yeah, because it's fascinating. I came across in my research the way in which Colin Wilson had initially dismissed Priestley as irrelevant, and I think at that time he was sharing a flat with, I think it was John Brain. Okay. And Brain really rated Priestley because I guess he was the Yorkshireman as well. I don't know, but he then started checking out Priestley's work in greater detail, and he became a huge fan. And Colin Wilson Priestley's work resonated with him for the same reason it resonated with me, because I've been a huge fan of Ouspensky for 30 odd years or something like that. But it was very much my introduction to I Have Been Here Before that really stunned me. Now, that play is absolutely incredible. The problem is it's the way it's written. And I know that your great-grandfather, he tried so hard and he rewrote it many, many times, purely and simply because it was the ideas that he was trying to get across, rather than writing what he would term the well-made play. It wasn't a piece of drama, it was a piece of philosophy. And I think you and I, when we went to see the German Street Theatre version, one of the issues that I think I was talking with Graham about this was what is really needed is somebody much, much younger to play Dr. Gortler. Just for the audience, Dr. Gortler is somebody who is literally living their life again and again, and they've realised the fact. Now, people who've read my first book will know I call this cheating the ferryman and this concept. But if we had a much younger version of Gortler who was much more dynamic, and maybe, I suppose you're never allowed to rewrite somebody's work, but the things that Gortler says are powerful. It's like Alan's speech in Time of the Conways. There are these, within these plays, there are these nuggets of sheer genius where you think, wow, that is incredible. And this is what Priestley did incredibly well. And he wrote incredibly enjoyable pieces of theatre. One can never doubt. I know that people feel very, very negative about an Inspector Calls, but that is purely and simply because it was on the O-level and A-level curricula for so many years that people got bored with it. But they've missed the message. The message is so powerful, isn't it? It's about guilt, responsibility, how you can destroy somebody's life by your own selfishness. And then you have the wonderful twist at the end of the identity of Inspector Gould. Brilliant. Simply brilliant. And even his earlier plays, Dangerous Corner. Dangerous Corner, phenomenal. But the thing for me that is the most important area of this book, and very much the book is a vehicle for the letters. And the letters were a group of letters that were written to JB Priestley in the early 1960s after he appeared on a program called late one Sunday evening. And at the end of it, Hugh Weldon, who was the guy who was the interviewer, Priestley had discussed the fact that he was going to be doing this this book, Man and Time. And he turned round and Hugh Weldon turned around to the audience and said, if anybody has had anomalous experiences with time of any description, please write in to us and we'll forward the letters to Priestley. Priestley was expecting to get a couple of dozen. He got thousands. Now, I was given the opportunity through Tom, again, I'd like to thank Tom Priestley for this. He facilitated my accessing these letters at the University of Cambridge Documents Library. And I think I'm right in saying that I'm the only person that's read most of them. I know that Dr. Kit Price had gone through some of them, but I think I'm the only person that's gone through them, or most of them, in detail. And these letters were just absolutely unbelievable, breathtaking. In the final third of the book, I discuss around about 40 of them, 35 of them, but I was spoiled for choice. And these are incidents that ordinary people had had extraordinary experiences. Very much, again, the idea that what Jack said about the idea of the veil of reality. I mean, there's one of them that I haven't mentioned in any of the interviews before, but it's in the book, about a young girl, and the writer was in her 50s or something, who was remembering back, and her grandmother used to live in a council flat in Cardiff. And she used to, because she was bored, she used to run down the stairs, out through the back entrance of the flats, running through the front entrance and go up the stairs again. And she was doing this one day, and she's running down the stairs, and she runs out, and it's a time slip. She runs out, and she's suddenly seeing the harbour there as it was in the 18th century. And she sees the vessels with their sails and everything else. And then it shimmers and disappears, and she's right back again in the 20th century. There are other characters who have time slips. One guy has this most amazing time slip in Gallipoli during the invasion at Gallipoli. Other people experience time slowing down. There's another wonderful letter from a guy who was at Dunkirk. And of course, with the new Dunkirk movie coming out, there's an interest in Dunkirk. And this incident that happens to this ordinary soldier is absolutely unbelievable. But these people have no reason to exaggerate, no reason to tell lies. And in fact, many of them say, you know, I've never spoken to anybody about these experiences. Now, my intention is to go back and go through the remaining 700 or 800 letters that I've got to read and put them together in a new book, because these letters are just so intriguing. I won't ruin them anymore for you in terms of that, but they're well worth looking at. Right, okay, Luke, we are out of time. I'm sorry to say. It's great speaking to you, but, you know, we meet regularly and talk about these things on a regular basis, so this is nothing new to us. So thanks, everybody, for watching this this program. The next program, I'll be interviewing Tim Freak, who was probably one of the most influential writers on my own writing career, because way back in about 1999, 2000, I read a book called The Jesus Mysteries, and it was this book written by Tim Freak and Peter Gandy, which introduced me to the concept of the daemon for the first time, and the Gnostic concept of the daemon. Tim has now had a very successful writing career and has published quite a few books, and we're going to be talking about his career and his new book as well for the next one. So thanks, everybody, for listening in, and as always, thanks to Radia Nunez over there in Denver, that for without this whole thing could not happen. Thanks very much, and bye-bye.